The snow had been falling since early morning, heavy and quiet, the kind that swallowed sound and made the forest feel sealed off from the rest of the world. Chris moved slowly between the trees, his boots sinking deep with every step. He wasn't out hunting. He was checking traps, making sure nothing had been left behind before the next storm closed the trails for good. He noticed the smell before he saw anything. Not sharp, not fresh, but wrong. Chris stopped and scanned the ground ahead, his eyes catching a dark shape half covered by snow near a fallen pine. He approached carefully, already knowing what he would find. The wolf lay on her side, stiff, her fur dusted white. One hind leg was twisted at an angle that didn't belong to any living thing. Chris crouched beside her, studying the marks in the snow. No blood, no clear signs of a fight. Likely a fall on ice, maybe days ago. Winter didn't forgive mistakes. He exhaled slowly and stood up, ready to move on, when a faint sound stopped him. It wasn't the wind. It came again, thin and uneven, almost lost beneath the snowfall. Chris turned his head and followed the sound into a tight cluster of young spruce. 4 small shapes huddled together beneath the branches. The wolf pups barely looked old enough to stand properly. Their coats were dull, their movements slow. One tried to growl when Chris stepped closer, but the sound broke into a weak whine instead. The others pressed in tighter, eyes wide and unfocused. Chris didn't move for a long moment. He knew better than to rush. He scanned the surrounding trees, half expecting a shadow to break free from the snow. Nothing moved. No tracks led away from the site except his own. He knelt and set his pack down, keeping his hands visible. The pups trembled, unsure whether to flee or fight. He didn't touch them. He just watched, counting their breaths, noting how shallow they were. They hadn't eaten in days. Leaving them like this wasn't an option. But taking them wasn't either. Chris stood and walked back to the dead wolf. He pulled his shovel from the pack and began to dig. The ground was hard, frozen deep, but he worked steadily, stopping only when his hands went numb. When the hole was deep enough, he rolled the wolf into it with care. He paused for a second, resting his hand against her shoulder, then covered her with earth and snow. No markers. No ceremony. Just a quiet end. When he turned back, the pups were gone. Chris felt his chest tighten. He moved quickly now, circling the area, scanning the tree line. Small tracks led off in different directions, uneven and frantic. He followed one trail until it disappeared under wind-blown snow, then another and another. He called out once, then stopped himself. Sound would only drive them farther. He searched until the light began to fade and the cold cut through his jacket. Nothing. The forest swallowed them completely. By the time he reached his cabin, night had settled in. Chris lit the stove and sat by the window, staring into the dark. He told himself there was nothing more he could have done. Still, as the wind shifted outside, he felt it again. That quiet pressure between the shoulders. The sense that the forest was not finished with him yet. The storm passed after 2 days, leaving the world buried under a hard, pale crust of snow. Chris stayed close to the cabin, chopping wood, clearing the path to the shed, moving through familiar routines that kept his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. Still, his eyes kept drifting toward the tree line, as if he expected the forest to answer something he hadn't asked out loud. On the 3rd evening, just as the light began to fade, he noticed movement beyond the glass doors that opened onto the backyard. At first he thought it was a shadow from the trees, stretched long by the low sun. Then it moved again, slow and deliberate. Chris froze. A wolf stood at the edge of the clearing. Large, gray, ribs faintly visible beneath its winter coat. It didn't step forward. It didn't bare its teeth. It simply stood there, head low, eyes fixed on the door. Chris felt his pulse rise but forced himself not to move. He scanned the snow around the wolf and then saw them. 4 smaller shapes, half hidden behind the adult's legs. The pups. Thinner than before, their movements hesitant, uncertain. Chris took a careful step back from the door, giving them space. The wolf watched every motion, muscles tight, ready to react. The air between them felt stretched thin, like a wire pulled too far. Minutes passed. No sound but the faint crackle of the stove behind him and the wind brushing the trees. Finally, the wolf shifted its weight and nudged one of the pups forward with its muzzle. The pup stumbled, then took another step, drawn by the light spilling through the glass. Chris slowly reached for the door handle. He paused, keeping his eyes on the wolf. The animal didn't charge. It didn't retreat. It waited. The door opened with a soft click. Cold air rushed in, carrying the sharp smell of snow and fur. The pups hesitated at the threshold, claws scraping lightly against the wood. One whined, uncertain. Another stepped inside, nose low, body tense. Chris stayed still as statues. One by one, the pups crossed into the warmth. Their bodies shook as the cold left them, breaths coming fast and uneven. They didn't run. They didn't explore. They clustered together just inside the door, eyes never leaving the wolf outside. The adult wolf remained where it was. Chris slowly closed the door once all four were inside. The sound was final, louder than he expected. The pups startled and rushed toward the glass, pressing their small bodies against it. Outside, the wolf lifted its head. The howl cut through the clearing, deep and raw, vibrating in Chris's chest. The pups answered with thin, broken cries, their paws sliding against the glass as they leaned into it. Chris swallowed hard, his hand resting against the doorframe. He didn't step forward. He didn't interfere. He watched as the wolf lowered its head, held the gaze of its pups for a long, heavy moment, then turned. The wolf walked back toward the forest without looking back. Its shape slipped between the trees and disappeared into the dark. The clearing fell silent again. Inside the cabin, the pups remained by the door, breathing fog onto the glass. Chris stood a few steps away, heart still racing. He understood one thing with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. This wasn't over. It had only begun. The nights grew longer after that. Chris slept in short stretches, never fully sinking into rest. Every sound pulled him back to the surface. A scrape of claws on wood. A sudden breath too close to his ear. The soft thump of bodies shifting on the floor as the pups searched for warmth. He changed the cabin without meaning to. Furniture moved closer to the walls. Tools were hung higher. Food stayed locked away. He cleared a corner near the stove and laid down old blankets, not as comfort, but as insulation from the cold that crept in through the floorboards. The pups stayed together at first. They moved as one, cautious, eyes tracking every step Chris took. He never reached for them. When he crossed the room, he did it slowly, announcing himself with sound rather than motion. He spoke only when necessary, his voice low, steady, meant to fill the space without pressing into it. Mornings began before sunrise. Chris chopped wood while the frost still clung to the trees, his breath rising in thick clouds. From inside the cabin, he could feel their eyes on him through the glass. They watched him the way wild things watched storms, alert but patient. He fed them outside whenever the weather allowed. Meat placed on the snow, hands withdrawn before they stepped forward. Some days they ate immediately. Other days they circled the food for long minutes, testing the air, glancing toward the forest as if expecting it to open and take them back. The cold settled deep into the weeks. Snow piled high against the cabin walls. Chris reinforced the doors, sealed gaps, kept the fire alive through the night. He learned to measure time by smaller things. How quickly the pups finished their food. How long they slept. How much space they needed to feel safe. They grew fast. Their legs strengthened. Their movements sharpened. The clumsy stumbles faded into quick, precise steps. Their play shifted too. It started as quiet nudges, then turned into sudden bursts of energy that rattled the walls and forced Chris to retreat into stillness. One evening, while Chris stacked firewood inside, one of the pups darted past him, brushing his leg. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't fearful. It was careless. Chris stopped where he stood. The pup skidded to a halt across the room and turned back, ears high, tail stiff with excitement. The others followed, circling wider now, their confidence growing with each breath. They weren't watching him anymore. They were testing the space. Chris backed away slowly, placing the wood down piece by piece. He kept his hands close to his body, his eyes soft but alert. The pups hesitated, sensing the shift, then retreated to their corner as if nothing had happened. But the line had been crossed. That night, Chris didn't sleep at all. He sat by the stove, listening to their breathing, staring into the fire. He knew this balance couldn't last forever. Warmth and shelter changed things, even for animals born wild. Outside, the forest pressed close, silent and waiting. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in that part of the forest. Snow didn't disappear all at once. It thinned, retreated, turned to dark slush along the paths Chris cleared each morning. The air softened, but the nights still carried cold. The pups changed with the season. They were no longer small shapes pressed together for warmth. Their legs lengthened. Their chests broadened. Their movements became decisive, controlled. They spent less time resting and more time watching, tracking sounds beyond the cabin walls that Chris couldn't hear. Chris adjusted again. Feeding moved farther from the house. He stopped leaving the door open even for a moment. When he worked outside, he kept his back to the wall and his eyes on the tree line. The pups followed him less now. They chose higher ground, shadows, places where the forest met the clearing. They were learning. Some nights, Chris heard them pacing instead of sleeping. Not restless, not afraid. Focused. Their noses pressed against the cracks in the walls, their ears tilted toward distant movement. The forest was calling them back in ways warmth and shelter couldn't erase. One afternoon, Chris returned from the shed and found deep scratches along the doorframe. Fresh. Deliberate. He stood there longer than necessary, running his fingers along the marks, measuring their depth. It wasn't damage. It was strength. He cleaned the marks away, but the image stayed. Weeks passed. The pups began slipping out of sight for hours at a time, returning with mud on their legs and burrs caught in their fur. Chris didn't follow. He didn't interfere. He watched, noted patterns, counted heads each evening. The balance grew thinner. One morning, while checking the fence line near the edge of the clearing, Chris stopped short. The ground was soft from melting snow, and the tracks stood out clearly. Large prints. Confident strides. Not the pups. Adult wolves. Chris crouched and studied them. They moved along the tree line, never crossing into the open. Whoever they belonged to knew the boundaries. Knew the cabin. That night, the pups didn't come inside at all. They stayed near the trees, watching the dark as if waiting for something to step forward. Chris stood by the glass door long after the fire burned low. He felt it again, that pressure between his shoulders, the sense of time running out. The forest hadn't forgotten them. It had found them. The clearing felt different that day. The air was warm enough to leave the jacket hanging by the door, and the ground had finally dried after weeks of thaw. Chris stepped outside slowly, scanning the tree line out of habit more than fear. Nothing moved. The pups followed him at a distance, spreading out across the clearing instead of staying close. They were restless, energized by space and light. One darted forward, then another, circling back, kicking up dirt as they ran. Chris allowed himself a moment. He picked up a fallen branch and tossed it a short distance. Not far. Not play the way people played with dogs. Just movement. The pups lunged for it, colliding in a rough knot of fur and limbs before breaking apart again. Their energy was sharp, almost wild. Chris smiled before he realized it. Then the forest exploded. The sound came first. Heavy bodies crashing through underbrush. Branches snapping. The clearing filled with motion as dark shapes burst from between the trees. Wolves. Adult wolves. Too many to count at once. Chris's breath caught. His body reacted before his thoughts did. He turned sharply toward the cabin and shouted the pups' names, his voice raw with urgency. He didn't wave. He didn't run toward them. He stood his ground and called again. The pups froze. For a split second, they stood torn between the clearing and the forest. Then instinct took over. One by one, they bolted toward the house, claws tearing into the dirt as they ran. Chris backed toward the door, never turning his eyes away from the advancing shapes. The wolves stopped at the edge of the clearing. They didn't charge. They spread out, forming a loose line where forest met open ground. Muscles tight. Eyes fixed. The pups reached the door and slipped inside, scrambling over each other in their rush. Chris followed, slamming the door shut behind him. Silence hit like pressure. The wolves remained where they were, watching. No growls. No howls. Just stillness stretched thin. Then movement. One wolf stepped forward, larger than the rest. Familiar in shape, in the way it carried its head. It moved alone, slow and deliberate, until it reached the spot where the clearing met the trees. It stopped there and looked directly at the cabin. Inside, the pups pressed themselves against the glass, breathing hard, eyes locked on the figure outside. Chris stood behind them, heart pounding, every muscle tight. He knew without understanding how he knew. This was not a hunt. This was something else entirely. The wolf stood just beyond the reach of the light spilling from the cabin. Close enough for every detail to be clear. Far enough to remind Chris where the line was. Its eyes never left the glass. Inside, the pups pressed forward, their breath fogging the door in uneven bursts. Their bodies were tense, tails low, ears angled forward. They didn't whine. They didn't scratch. They watched. Chris stayed a step behind them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward the door. Every instinct told him that sound or sudden motion would break something fragile that had formed without permission. The wolf shifted its weight and stepped closer. Now it was fully visible, standing square in front of the glass. Its coat was scarred in places, for missing along one shoulder, an old injury that had healed wrong. It wasn't a young animal. It wasn't strong in the way the others were. But it stood there without hesitation. The pups reacted immediately. Their bodies leaned into the door, paws lifting, noses pressed flat against the cold surface. One let out a low sound, not a cry, not a call. Recognition. Chris felt his throat tighten. The wolf lowered its head slightly, just enough to bring its eyes level with the pups. It held that position, unmoving, as if waiting for something to settle. The clearing behind it remained still. The rest of the pack stayed back, watching but not interfering. Minutes passed. Chris's mind raced, but his body stayed still. He understood now what he hadn't wanted to admit before. Shelter had bought time. Warmth had kept them alive. But it had never changed what they were. The pups turned their heads slightly, glancing back at him. Not fear. Not confusion. A pause. Chris stepped forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, until he stood beside them. He didn't touch the door at first. He rested his hand against the wall, grounding himself, then reached out and placed his palm lightly against one pup's shoulder. Just pressure. Just presence. He spoke quietly, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. He told them it was time. He told them this was right. The words didn't matter. Chris unlocked the door. The click sounded loud in the silence. The pups stiffened. The wolf outside raised its head. Chris opened the door just enough to let cold air spill inside. The smell of forest rushed in, sharp and alive. The pups hesitated, bodies coiled tight, standing on the edge between warmth and instinct. One stepped forward, then stopped. It turned back and pressed its body briefly against Chris's leg. Not a nuzzle. Not affection. Contact. The others followed, each brushing past him in turn. Fur against denim. Heat against skin. A moment that lasted no longer than it needed to. Chris didn't move. The pups stepped outside. They crossed the threshold and paused, all four of them, standing in a tight line just beyond the door. For a heartbeat, they looked back. Then the wolf turned toward the forest. The pups followed. The forest swallowed them quickly. One moment the pups were there, moving in a tight line behind the wolf, and the next they were broken into shadows and branches, their shapes dissolving into the dark between the trees. Chris stood in the doorway long after they disappeared. Cold air filled the cabin, slipping past him, carrying the sounds of the forest back to where they belonged. He didn't close the door right away. He waited until the clearing felt empty again. When he finally stepped inside and shut the door, the silence felt heavier than before. The next days passed without incident. No pacing at night. No sudden movement by the glass. Chris returned to his routines, slower now, more deliberate. He fixed a loose board near the steps. Repaired the fence along the back edge of the clearing. Life pressed forward the way it always did. Sometimes, while cutting wood or hauling water, he stopped and listened. The forest sounded the same, but it felt different. Less crowded. More settled. Weeks went by. One morning, just after sunrise, Chris noticed shapes at the edge of the tree line. He didn't reach for his binoculars. He didn't step closer. He already knew. Wolves. They stood where the shadows broke against the clearing, far enough to keep distance, close enough to be seen. There was no movement toward the house. No sound. Just presence. Chris nodded once, more to himself than to them, and went back to his work. When he looked again later, the tree line was empty. It happened again months later. Different weather. Different light. The same quiet watching from a place that respected the line. Chris never tried to approach them. He never left food. He never waved or called out. He understood the rules now. The forest gave no explanations. Over time, the visits grew less frequent. Life filled the space they left behind. Seasons shifted. Snow returned, lighter this time, dusting the clearing without burying it. On a cold evening, Chris stood by the glass door and looked out into the dark. Nothing moved. The clearing belonged only to moonlight and wind. He rested his hand against the doorframe, feeling the solid weight of the cabin, the life he had chosen. He hadn't saved them forever. He hadn't changed their path. He had simply stepped aside when it mattered. That was enough.
Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories. And now just click the playlist or the next video on your screen.